You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of Clio Digital Media, and support for this episode comes from the Massachusetts Historical Society, the first historical society founded in the United States in 1791. Hello, and welcome to Ben Franklin's World Revisited, a series of classic episodes that bring fresh perspective to our latest episodes and add deeper connections to our understanding of early American history. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. In episode 440, Brooke Newman walked us through one of the most striking edits to the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson's cut grievance that King George III was responsible for the transatlantic slave trade and for exciting enslaved people to rise in arms against their enslavers during the American War for Independence. Now, Brooke made a careful and complicated case. While the British monarchy bore deep responsibility for launching England into the slave trade, Jefferson's specific charge against King George III was, in Brooke's word, disingenuous. Now, as for Dunmore's proclamation, that 1775 promise of freedom that Jefferson cast as King George III's most provocative crime, George III had almost nothing to do with it. Lord Dunmore acted on his own initiative as a military expedient in the king's name. British officials in London didn't plan for Dunmore's proclamation either, and the Crown was careful not to extend it as imperial policy across the Caribbean and the Loyalist South. But that's the British side of the story. So let's stand on the other side of Dunmore's proclamation and ask a different question. What happened to the people who answered his call? And what happened when the people who fled to British lines in expectation of freedom were women, not able-bodied men willing to fight for the Crown? In episode 322, we spoke with Karen Cook Bell, who is now a professor of history at Bowie State University. Karen is the award-winning author of Running from Bondage, Enslaved Women and the Remarkable Fight for Freedom in Revolutionary America. Now, Karen's work centers on a story that earlier histories of the Revolution have overlooked: the experience of Black women who self-emancipated by running away to British lines, often with children in tow, sometimes while pregnant, and always against extraordinary odds. Now, during our exploration, Karen reveals how Dunmore's proclamation and the Philipsburg Proclamation of 1779 transformed the landscape of resistance for enslaved women across the rebellious colonies. Why motherhood, long thought to bind women to slavery, often served as the very catalyst for their escape. And the creative and subversive strategies that women used to self-emancipate, including disguising themselves as men, as soldiers, as free white women, and the networks of kin and community that sustained them along the way. But first, before we return to our conversation with Karen, a personal note. Ben Franklin's World keeps going because of the people who believe in it. Listeners like you and the sponsors who help make this work possible, which is why I want to come to you first. If you run a business, lead a brand, or know someone who does, and you'd like to reach an audience of curious readers, educators, writers, and lifelong learners, I'd love to have a conversation with you about sponsoring this podcast. Our listeners are thoughtful, engaged, and deeply connected to this community. They show up every week because they trust what we do together, and that trust extends to the partners I choose, which is why fit matters so much. I want sponsors who will bring real value to our audience and who are excited to reach them. If that sounds like you, please reach out at benfranklinsworld.com/sponsor. That's benfranklinsworld.com/sponsor. All right. Are you ready to revisit our conversation with Karen Cook Bell? Allow me to reintroduce you. Joining us is an associate professor of history at Bowie State University. She specializes in the history of slavery, the Civil War and Reconstruction, and women's history. She's an award-winning author of numerous articles and 2 books, including her most recent book, Running from Bondage, Enslaved Women and the Remarkable Fight for Freedom in Revolutionary America. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Karen Cook Bell.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. Now, Karen, I'm curious what brings you to the American Revolution. You are a scholar who's really known for studying the histories of slavery and women in the Civil War era, so what brings you back in time to study slavery and women during the Revolutionary era?
Certainly. My teaching, research, and writing is focused on telling the stories of people who have been marginalized from power and its archive. And I am a proponent of history from below, and in particular, looking at how African Americans navigated slavery and freedom. So my research and writing have really focused on war and society, and both the American Revolution and the Civil War were transformative events that impacted African American freedom. And really researching my first book, Claiming Freedom, which focuses on the Civil War Reconstruction period, introduced me to women who fled slavery during the late 18th century. And this led me to question how widespread was the escape of enslaved women. And the American Revolution, of course, was a watershed moment in which thousands of enslaved people escaped, and which, according to historian Benjamin Quarles, saw the first large-scale slave rebellion in American history. So, of course, I wanted to tell the story of these women who fled or who attempted to flee slavery during the Revolutionary era. I also believed it was important to take a deep dive into examining the lived experiences of the women who fled and to think deeply about how they sought to reimagine their world and create new spaces for themselves during a very violent era.
So now that you've written 2 books about women who ran away from their bondage, just how widespread do you think the escape of enslaved women was between the Revolutionary and Civil War eras?
I think certainly during the Revolutionary period, resistance in the form of escape was fairly widespread, as well as during the Civil War. I think war in general is a disruptive process, and enslaved people took advantage of every opportunity to escape during both conflicts to escape their enslavement. So when we think about the idea of slave resistance during both periods, we have to underscore and keep in mind how disruptive war was for slavery. And in fact, both wars were important in the sense that proclamations were issued which further disrupted the process of slavery. And I think, those ideas that impacted the Revolutionary period certainly had a transformative impact on the escape of enslaved people.
Well, let's start digging into some of your research. Now, in your book, Running from Bondage, you really focus on the lives of some of the women who escaped their enslavement by running away, just before, during, and after the American War for Independence. Now, you note in Running from Bondage that historians have investigated different aspects of slave resistance during the Revolution, but that you have written the first book that focuses on the escape experiences of enslaved women during the Revolutionary era. So, Karen, could you tell us about slavery during the Revolutionary era and why you think it's important for us to view the experiences of enslaved women who fled their bondage apart from the experiences of enslaved men who also ran away from their enslavement?
Well, first and foremost, historians once considered Black participation in the American Revolution to be marginal. However, over the past 5 decades, numerous books and articles on this subject have dispelled that idea, and Black participation in the American Revolution is now an integral part of the story of American freedom. However, the experiences of Black women who fled slavery during the American Revolution has largely not been examined. And a part of the reason why that is the case is because the history books had previously ignored the experiences of Black women during slavery. And this began to change with the publication of Deborah Bray White's book, Aren't I a Woman, in 1985, which examines the Black female experience during slavery. However, even with this publication, the consensus in the scholarship was that Black women did not flee bondage because of family ties and responsibilities. In other words, their positions as mothers and wives prevented them from escaping slavery. So my book refutes that idea. I demonstrate that motherhood often served as a catalyst for attempted escape during the American Revolution. The underlying causes of women's flight were efforts to protect their bodies and womanhood against the violence and exploitation that was an everyday feature of their lived experience, as well as to protect their children from the harmful effects of slavery. So what I found in my book is that the average age of a self-emancipated woman was 22, And women between the ages of 18 and 25 predominate in the advertisements. Also, girls as young as 13 escape independently, and women as old as 62 escape with their daughters and families. And what was especially surprising is that women also ran away pregnant. So Black women's resistance really matters in the historical discourse on slave resistance because the history books have tended to focus on resistance as exclusively an experience belonging to Black men. So by examining the histories of women who escaped slavery, scholars begin to more fully understand and appreciate the ways in which enslaved women, who comprised 1/3 of all runaways during the Revolutionary period, were an integral part of the early abolitionist movement.
I appreciate that explanation because there are a lot of earlier histories about African Americans in the Revolutionary War era that really focus solely on the resistance and escape attempts of Black men. And, when it comes to women, these earlier studies tend to say, well, of course women didn't run away. They were wives, they were mothers, they had elderly family members. All these people would have hindered their ability to make a successful run for it. So they just kind of ignore women, saying that women didn't have opportunities to run away. Or instead of blaming family members, they blame women's lack of runaway attempts to unskilled labor, that they didn't have the skills they would need to support themselves once they ran away and received their freedom. So your research really does reveal a very different story.
Right. When we think of skilled labor, I think we have to really expand our definition of what that means. Certainly, under the tax labor system, women worked away from their enslavers in the fields as well as in the spaces in between the fields in positions such as poultry minders, as dairy women, gardeners, nurses, and midwives. These positions gave women a degree of independence and mobility. And in my book, I demonstrate how Black women who escaped slavery from the South Carolina countryside sought employment in Charleston in various occupations such as washerwomen, seamstresses, or market women, exhibiting freedom through dress language and employment skills. So certainly during the Revolutionary period itself, of course, chaos of war and lack of oversight made the escape of Black women possible in both the North and South. And what I argue and demonstrate in Running from Bondage is that motherhood, freedom, and love of family often served as a catalyst for attempted escape. And in fact, enslaved women had as much incentive to run away as did men, and perhaps even more since they were abused physically, sexually, and psychologically. And of course, enslaved women who were mothers fleeing bondage disrupts the narrative that all female slaves were bound to their enslavers through their offspring. The figures for how many enslaved women escaped bondage are not definitive because not every runaway generated an advertisement. So it is feasible that the number of runaways was at least double the extant number since not all newspapers were published consistently, and many enslavers did not advertise for the return of their runaways. Certainly capturing a runaway slave was expensive. One had to pay for the advertisement, the jail costs, as well as the reward.
You mentioned ads for runaway enslaved people, that women between the ages of 18 and 25 predominated in advertisements for runaway enslaved women, and that purchasing an ad and putting out an ad was one of the costs of trying to recover a runaway enslaved person. And you would know all of this because you used a ton of advertisements for runaway enslaved women in your book, Running from Bondage. So would you tell us more about these advertisements and what they reveal about the women they advertised for?
I examined over 1,000 runaway slave newspaper ads, and really the scholarship on slave resistance, especially in the context of slave life, is based on runaway slave advertisements. Posting advertisements in newspapers was the most pervasive method used to secure a return of runaway women and girls. So, these runaway newspaper advertisements really tell us a great deal about the enslaved. These advertisements lean heavily toward the physical. They offer detailed information about the facial and bodily features of slaves, their origin and ethnicity, where they may have gone and rewards for their return. The advertisements really reflect on-the-ground collective transformations of names, ethnic changes, and identities. So I really consider each fugitive slave advertisement to be a valuable piece of evidence because it reveals the agency of enslaved women who, despite formidable obstacles, risked everything, including their lives, for freedom. Each advertisement describes the story of a real person, not an abstraction. And when additional research is done in other sources, real human beings begin to emerge from the records. Certainly what is frustrating about the ads is that we do not know the fate of the majority of the individuals named in the advertisements, but given these limitations, the ads offer a remarkable amount of information about people who were caught up in a horrific system of bondage.
Is there a particularly fascinating or surprising ad that you could share with us so that we can get a sense of how these ads were structured and of all the information they might contain?
Well, I can share an ad for Jenny, who escaped slavery in 1776. And I'll just read the ad here. Runaway last September from the subscriber, living upon Monk's Neck, about 13 miles above the town of Petersburg, a Virginia-born Negro wench named Jenny, who carried with her a child named Winnie. The wench was very big with child when she went away, is about 25 years old, near 5 feet 2 inches high, and of a yellow complexion. She carried with her a green chaloon gown, a pale blue Durant's quilt, much worn, a white Virginia cloth cotton coat and waistcoat, coat and waistcoat striped with copperas and blue, and another suit checked with blue. The child is between 2 and 3 years old, is of a yellower complexion than its mother, and clothes like her. As she generally goes well dressed, I expect she will alter her name and the child's and will endeavor to pass as a free woman. And this is from Purdy's Virginia Gazette, April the 11th, 1777. So this ad tells us a great deal about Jenny. We know where she was born, where she lived, how old she was, her height, how she looked, what she wore and carried with her, and with whom she ran away. We know she was a mother to a toddler, and both could be classified as mulatto based on the ad's description. We also know that she would pass as a free woman based on her dress, her complexion, and we can assume her manner of speech.
I know you said that one of the annoying things about these advertisements is they're very descriptive. They can tell you a lot about a person, but they rarely tell you the fate of the person that they're advertising for. But all the same, as you did all of your research, did you ever get a sense of how successful a runaway ad was as a method of helping enslavers find and capture their runaway enslaved people?
I did in several instances. In the case of Margaret Grant, for example, she ran away twice, both times from Baltimore, Maryland. She ran away first time in 1770 and again in 1773. So she was caught after her first attempt and she ran away again in 1773. But certainly most of the ads that I've examined don't reveal the ultimate fate of the women who fled or who escaped slavery. So that is certainly the frustrating part of examining runaway slave advertisements, is that we don't get a sense of the ultimate fate of the individuals named in the advertisements.
Another aspect I think we're curious about is we get a sense from the ad that you told us about for Jenny, just how descriptive these ads could be. They really help you paint a mental image of the person that the enslaver is hoping to find. And yet, if you think about it, these are just descriptions, and they're not as vivid as, say, a picture or a sketch of someone. So, did these ads and their physical descriptions of runaway enslaved people ever pose a risk for free African Americans? Were any free African Americans mistakenly identified as someone in a runaway advertisement because photo technology just didn't exist yet?
Right, that's certainly true. But I think, again, my book focuses on a time period when there was disruption in society. So in the context of war, I think in terms of trying to capture and return a runaway slave, I think that it was more a haphazard process and certainly not as organized as the process became during the antebellum period when there were planters, traders, sheriffs, local courts involved in the systematic capture and return of runaways.
That's an excellent point. Wars, as you mentioned, are periods of great disruption and they're violent. And so if you're busy fighting a war or trying to protect yourself and your family from a battle or an earlier colonial protest, then you're likely just too distracted and don't have the time to really go out and find an enslaved person that's run away. It's like you post an ad and hope for the best.
Right, exactly. And I think that is why, this period, again, according to historian Benjamin Crowes, was really the first large-scale slave rebellion because of the disruption that occurred under the system of slavery. And certainly estimates of the number of slaves who escaped vary. Herbert Aptheker estimated that, 100,000 slaves escaped during the Revolutionary period. But of course, other estimates, even from Thomas Jefferson, for example, put that number at 30,000 in Virginia. So certainly it was a large-scale disruptive process that undermined slavery. And I think when we think about the American Revolution and the Civil War, I think really these two wars really had a transformative impact on slavery.
So say you're Margaret Grant or Jenny or one of the other numerous women who you found that ran away and self-emancipated during the Revolutionary era. What was the process like for these women? What kind of process did they go through to make their decision to run away and then carry that decision into action?
Well, certainly enslaved women faced many obstacles in planning an escape from environmental to physical and challenges related to the nature of warfare. In terms of environmental challenges, enslaved women had to contend with the elements, be it extreme cold or heat. In terms of physical challenges, women had to contend with the topography, the forests, creeks, swamps, and rivers. And in terms of the nature of warfare, there were challenges with regard to remaining in encampments. In Virginia, for example, diseases such as smallpox led to the death of scores of women and men on Gwen Island. So what's interesting about the way in which enslaved women escape is that in many cases, they did not run haphazardly into the woods, but developed creative and subversive escape strategies. They disguised themselves as waiting boys and men, as Margaret Grant did. They feigned physical and mental illness, disguised themselves and dressed as soldiers. And of course, they also sought to impersonate white women if they were fair-skinned. I also came across women who escaped not only on foot, but also by boat and on horseback. Sarah, for example, and her 6-year-old son escaped on horseback from Fredericksburg, Maryland. And they were assisted in their escape by Valentine Lynn, who was a white tailor with whom Sarah had a relationship. She took an assortment of clothing with her, including bedding and a large sum of money from her enslaver, George Somerville. And they escaped really in the thick of the Revolutionary era in 1778. And the advertisement indicated that Somerville, her enslaver, believed that Valentine Lynn would be acting as her husband. So again, women developed very creative and subversive escape strategies during the war and after.
So it sounds like if you were a woman who wanted to self-emancipate by running away, at minimum, you would have had to consider the geography around you and how you might travel within it and, perhaps make it to a new geography. You'd also have to think about the weather and all the clothing you need to protect yourself from the elements. And I have to think you'd also need to think about food. What were you going to eat on your journey to freedom? So, Karen, this leads me to wonder, just how much did women have to pack in their flight from slavery? Did they really have to pack a lot of clothing and provisions to help see them to safety?
That's what's interesting about the ads is that they took a great deal of clothing with them. They took a great deal of bedding with them. They took articles that they believed they would need as they escaped slavery. I think when we contemplate the ways in which African American women escaped bondage, we also have to think about networks that they may have used to escape. Historian Damian Pargas, for example, argues that slave families and communities in rural areas provided fugitives with the social networks that were necessary to sustain themselves for long periods of time without being caught. And that fugitive women who remained in the countryside were almost always partly or wholly harbored by loved ones, sometimes within slave households, but also often in the forests that bordered the plantations or farms. And certainly in northern cities, free Black communities often aided and assisted runaways. Ona Judge, the escaped slave of George and Martha Washington, for example, was aided by the free Black community in Philadelphia when she escaped slavery in 1796.
That's a great point. We do need to consider the fact that during the Revolutionary era, networks of people did exist who would help enslaved people effect their escape plans and reach the safety of British lines or some other place that they knew to be safe. And that's really interesting because I think when we normally think of an enslaved person effecting their escape, our minds naturally take us to the antebellum period, to just before the Civil War, where there was the Underground Railroad, an organized network of people who objected to slavery and were willing to help runaway enslaved people make their way to free states and to Canada. And yet, these networks that existed in the Revolutionary period weren't formally organized, and yet there were networks of assistance. And that's really interesting to think about.
There was. It may not have been as organized in terms of having stations identified or as complex as the Underground Railroad, but certainly an informal network did exist that abetted enslaved women and men as they sought to escape slavery.
Now, if you were an enslaved person who wanted to make use of these informal networks to effect your escape, how would you have gained access to them?
Well, in the case of Ona Judge, she lived in Philadelphia for periods of time while the Washingtons were in Philadelphia. Philadelphia, of course, was the nation's capital, and Martha and George Washington would bring certain slaves with them to live and assist them in Philadelphia up until a period of about 6 months at a time. So Ona was able to really develop a network with the free Black community in Philadelphia, and they aided and assisted her. But during the war, escaped women and men relied on the British forces to aid and assist them as they escaped slavery.
During the Revolutionary era, every colony turned state practiced slavery. So if you were an enslaved person who wished to gain your freedom through escape, where did you run away to? We have to take a moment to talk about our episode sponsor. And when we get back, Karen, I'd love for you to answer this question for us. As Karen Cook Bell revealed, the family ties that earlier historians believed kept enslaved women in bondage often became their most powerful reason to run from it. This insight in historical evidence is exactly the kind of history and information Ben Franklin's World exists to bring you. And now, I'd like to take a moment to talk about what makes this podcast possible. As I mentioned at the start, support for this episode comes from the Massachusetts Historical Society, the first historical society founded in the United States in 1791. Our partnership with the MHS helps us bring you more resources and keeps our content freely available. But this partnership is only part of the picture of what keeps this podcast and our newsletters going. The other part is you. Ben Franklin's World has always been a community effort. We've been producing this show for nearly 12 years now, and it's only been possible because listeners like you believe that this work matters. The work of making rigorous historical scholarship accessible and available to anyone who has an interest. So if you've been listening to this podcast for a while and the show has become part of your regular routine, I'd love for you to consider supporting us. You can make a tax-deductible donation at benfranklinsworld.com/donate. That's benfranklinsworld.com/donate. Every bit of support helps, so thank you so much for your help and for your consideration. Karen, we know that during the Revolutionary era, every colony turned state practiced slavery. So, where did those who wished to gain their freedom by escape run away to? Where did they think they would be safe from capture and re-enslavement?
Well, the British gained control of New York. They gained control of Philadelphia. They gained control of Charleston and Savannah during the Southern campaign. So again, as a result of really both Dunmore's proclamation of 1775 and the Phillipsburg proclamation of 1779, offering freedom to escaped slaves, you had African Americans really seeking to gain their freedom by reaching British lines, by reaching British forces. So during the early campaigns of the war, African American women sought to reach British forces in New York, as well as during the siege of Boston. Certainly during other times of the war, for example, when the British occupied Philadelphia, enslaved women sought to reach Philadelphia. And that was certainly the case with Bette, who escaped slavery. So when we think about the Revolutionary period and how disruptive it was, we have to keep in mind that British forces had occupied certain areas within what becomes the United States. And they were able to, in essence, guarantee the freedom of those who had escaped.
For those who did effect a successful escape, what did freedom look like behind British lines? If you were a self-emancipated woman, how did you experience British camp life?
Certainly it varied. For example, when the British occupied Charleston, African American women worked in a number of positions, not only providing labor support, but also as nurses, and also they worked in ordnance as laundresses. And they also served as spies. But again, when we think about what happened with Lord Dunmore and Gwen Allen, African American women were left in a very vulnerable condition when they reached British forces, where many of them died. In New York, New York became really a safe haven for African American women as well as men. And of course, when the British departed the United States in 1783, 3,000 African Americans, mostly of whom were former slaves, left with them. So the treatment that they received by the British varied, but many perceived running away to the lines of the British to be more advantageous for their circumstances than remaining a slave or remaining on a plantation with the Patriot forces.
So it sounds like life in a British camp would be quite dangerous, a different type of dangerous than being enslaved on a plantation. But you mentioned disease, that you could go to these camps and catch a deadly disease, or that you might be employed in a very dangerous job, such as military ordnance handling. And although you didn't mention it, we are talking about self-emancipated women who entered these British camps, which are very male domains. They're filled with men, and these women are vulnerable. So, Karen, did you come across any sources of formerly enslaved women who fled to British lines and then encountered all of these men within camp?
Well, certainly women, again, were in very vulnerable condition when they did escape, but many did escape with their fathers. They escaped with their brothers. They escaped with their husbands. But certainly for other women who escaped alone, yes, they certainly did and could experience exploitation at the hands of British forces. And I did come across instances where that, in fact, happened. But I think by and large, the vast majority of women believed and perceived the British as an emancipating force, a force that could guarantee their freedom, and sought to secure their freedom by reaching British forces and dealing with the consequences, be they disease or sexual exploitation. And I think, again, with Phillipsburg Proclamation being issued in 1779, promising freedom to those slaves owned by Patriot forces, even if they did not serve the British Army, had a really powerful effect on slave women and men as they self-emancipated.
We've talked about British lines and proclamations that offered enslaved people their freedom, like Dunmore's proclamation of 1775. And yet, There were several states like Massachusetts and Rhode Island that, during the War for Independence, offered freedom to African Americans who picked up arms and joined the regiments of those states. Did you find any cases in your research where enslaved women ran to these freedom-offering revolutionary lines, or were they solely running to British lines?
Yes. During the early phases of the war in the northern and New England states, women were seeking to run away to reach British forces in those areas. And most states did, in fact, actually begin to enlist slave and free Blacks for military service during the war. They were enlisting slaves with the understanding that they were to receive freedom at the end of their military service. But again, only 5,000 Black men really served with the Patriot Army, and they came primarily from the North, even though the majority of the Black population was in the South. So certainly women did seek to reach British forces during the early campaigns of the war, and also, of course, with regard to the Patriot Army recruiting Black men. There were Black women who served in Patriot encampments, especially, for example, with George Washington at Delaware and other areas of encampments during the war.
It doesn't really sound like, with their emphasis on martial service, that revolutionary forces offered enslaved women many opportunities to gain their freedom through service.
Exactly. That's again why the British forces were viewed as an emancipating force, especially as word circulated about the Somerset decision in 1772, which was a case in England in which a slave named James was enslaved by a Virginia planter, and he had run away to reach England, and he was trying not to be returned to the colonies. So the court in this case ruled that there was no positive law in England that required the enslavement of persons of African descent. And as a result, James Somerset was considered a free person. And I think when we think about the position and status of women during this time period, again, the British forces were perceived as that emancipatory force, whereas the Patriot forces were viewed and perceived as the enslavers. So certainly they would be inclined to secure their freedom by aiding and serving with the Loyalist forces.
What is interesting about the revolutionary forces, though, is that they have this rhetoric of freedom. Americans acknowledged in the Declaration of Independence that they were fighting for independence to secure freedom from tyranny, from an oppressive king and from an oppressive parliament. So, Karen, as you were doing your research, did you find any insight or statements from the self-emancipating women that you were studying that talked about what they made of the revolutionaries' talk of liberty and freedom?
Right. Certainly, enslaved people were very much aware of the politics of the revolution. Even before fighting began, they petitioned the legislatures for their freedom. In Massachusetts, drawing inspiration from the political ideology of the revolutionary crisis. Certainly, they understood natural rights philosophy of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I think that, the revolution, of course, affirmed the idea that freedom was a universal birthright, and Black women seized upon every opportunity really to undermine the system of slavery through whites. Again, because they too believe in the independence of the individual, and they value in the most fundamental way what Thomas Jefferson and others identified as inalienable rights. So when we think about the leading theoreticians of the revolutionary era, such as James Otis and Isaac Skillman and Anthony Benezet, who argued that enslaved people had every right to rebel against the system and that there could never be legal title in the ownership of another human being, African Americans understood what that meant. And they understood through their lived experience, certainly, that slavery was an abomination that was not ordained by God. And freedom lived in the hearts and minds of enslaved people. So it is no wonder that when the Revolutionary War begins and the rhetoric of the revolutionaries is certainly pervasive throughout this period, that African Americans would seek freedom by running away and reaching the lines of British forces, whom again they saw as liberators versus, again, the Continentals, who they perceived as their enslavers.
Earlier, you mentioned that some enslaved women who self-emancipated did so with their brothers, their fathers, their children, and even with some other friends and family members. And Lydia would like to know more about how women put together this group of people to run away with, and whether chances for success improved when women ran away with a group versus attempting an independent escape.
I think in the context of war, it certainly did. There were cases throughout the war, even on Thomas Jefferson's plantation, where, groups of people escaped slavery together. And I think when we think about African American kinship networks, these networks included both fictive and non-fictive kin relations. So the lived experience of slavery created a situation where both fictive kin groups and non-fictive kin groups could escape slavery together. Escaped slaves, for example, on Thomas Jefferson's plantation consisted of men, women, and children who were bound together by family and kinship relations, but also non-kin relations. There were 23 slaves who abandoned Jefferson's estate, and there were included in that group 10 adult women and 3 girls. Now, they escaped certainly with their husbands and their children. But again, the shared experience of slavery created a situation and the context in which groups of people could escape together and escape successfully together by reaching the lines of the British forces.
So within your research, were you able to discern a pattern of whether more women ran away from their bondage in groups versus running away independently?
I think what's interesting is that prior to the Revolutionary period, and the scholarship bears this out, is that the vast majority of persons who escaped slavery did so individually. But during the Revolutionary period, we have and we see more people escaping in groups.
Now, what happened when an escape attempt failed? Did your research reveal any details about what happened to those women who ran away but failed to reach British lines?
Well, in the case of African Americans who were owned by loyalists and who believed that, they would gain their freedom because, again, they were siding with British forces. What ultimately happened is that those slaves ended up in Florida as the continued property of those loyalist planters or enslavers. They also ended up in the Caribbean where they were re-enslaved. So I think certainly when we think about escaping slaves and the potential for their freedom, there are these caveats where after the war, enslavers who were loyalists migrated to Florida and retained their human property. And of course, when the British left the United States in 1783 and loyalists went with them, they took their slaves and re-enslaved them or transferred that bondage into the Caribbean, where they lived out the rest of their lives enslaved.
What do we know about the numbers? Did the British keep any records about how many enslaved women, men, and children made their way to British lines during the Revolution?
The most detailed or extensive account of records that we have of British emancipation of enslaved people is the Book of Negroes. The Book of Negroes has recorded about 3,000 names of persons who were documented and received certificates of freedom from British forces and who were sent to or immigrated to Nova Scotia as well as to England after the war. So in terms of that dimension, that dynamic. We do have those records.
You mentioned at the start of our conversation that part of the problem with the historical sources we have for people who self-emancipated during the Revolutionary War is that they don't happen to tell you much about what happened when these people lived their free lives. But as you did your research, did you come across any sources that reveal what happened to a self-emancipating woman and what her life was like as a free person?
Ona Judge is perhaps the most complete record that we have of an escaped slave and what happened to her after her escape. Ona escaped in 1796 from Philadelphia. She was a dower slave. She belonged to the estate of Martha Washington, who willed all of her property to her granddaughters, including Ona Judge. But Ona escaped to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where she lived out the rest of her life until she died around 1848. What's interesting is that George Washington sent his nephew, Dearl Bassett, twice to recover her from New Hampshire, and he was unsuccessful both times. The former governor and senator from New Hampshire, John Langdon, informed Ona of the plans to recover her by the Washingtons, and she left town before she could be captured. So Ona's narrative, she told her life story to a reporter for the Liberator magazine, the most important anti-slavery publication. But her story is perhaps the most complete story that we have of a fugitive slave who escaped bondage and who was successful and was able to recount or tell her story from the post-revolutionary period.
Before we move into the time warp, I wonder if we could take a step back and look at your research as a whole. You've researched and written 2 books about self-emancipation, one for the Revolutionary War era and one for the Civil War era. And I wonder, is there anything that you found quite surprising about the sameness, or perhaps, surprising about the differences between what it was like to run away from bondage during these 2 different periods and 2 different conflicts?
I think in both cases, in both the American Revolution and the Civil War, African American women were motivated by the desire for freedom for themselves and their families. In both cases, a wartime proclamation abetted their escape, both Dunmore's proclamation and the Phillipsburg proclamation, and of course, Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. In both wars, women used the chaos of war to escape slavery. So certainly there are similarities between the Revolutionary War and the Civil War in terms of the ways in which African Americans sought to escape slavery. But again, I think we see in both wars that African Americans escaped slavery in groups, and these groups were based on not just only kinship, but also non-kin relationships. So I think in terms of looking at what's surprising about the Revolutionary period, certainly is that more women and children are escaping slavery. And these women and children, under tremendous obstacles, are able to navigate the terrain, the geography, the topography, and reach British forces traveling incredibly long distances. And we see this coming to its ultimate culmination in New York City when 3,000 mostly escaped slaves leave the United States for Nova Scotia and for England and are able to certainly live challenging lives in Nova Scotia that ultimately lead them to leave Nova Scotia for Sierra Leone. But I think the courage and fortitude of the women and children who escaped speaks to certainly aspects of a collective past where gender does not serve as an impediment to escape, but of course serves as a transformative force that allows women and their children to make an effort to reach a specific region where they're able to find freedom in the midst of a very dire and difficult circumstance.
Let's move into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently, or if someone had acted differently. In your opinion, what might have happened had the Continental Army issued a similar proclamation to the one issued by Lord Dunmore in 1775? If the United States had guaranteed freedom to any enslaved person who took up arms against Great Britain, how might the course of the Revolution and its war for independence have been different?
With the exception of Georgia and South Carolina, most states did actually begin to enlist slaves that free Blacks for military service during the war. But if southern states like Georgia and South Carolina had guaranteed freedom to slaves who fought against the British, I believe those slaves would have turned their weapons on the men and women who held them and their families in bondage, which is why those states chose not to arm their slaves. So it's interesting and it's telling that only 5,000 Black men served the Patriot Army compared to, by most estimates, 20,000 Black people who aided the Loyalist cause during the war.
What's next for you, Karen? What are you researching and writing about now?
I currently have a book under contract with Cambridge University Press on Southern Black women's struggle for freedom during the Civil War and Reconstruction period that examines the many struggles and challenges that African American women faced as they transitioned from slavery to freedom. The book consists of 8 essays by established and young scholars who offer new insights into the second most tumultuous period in American history.
Fantastic. And how can we reach you if we have more questions about your work and about self-emancipation through escape during the Revolutionary era?
Sure. KarenCookBell.com is my web address, or you can follow me on Twitter at KBPHD08.
Karen Cookbell, thank you for speaking with us and for helping us better understand what it was like for enslaved women to flee their bondage during the American Revolution.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
The American Revolution looked different from the throne than it looked on the ground. From the top down, Dunmore's proclamation was an improvisation, a wartime gambit by a royal governor who was running out of options to rein in the revolution. So government officials in Whitehall didn't plan for it. The British Crown didn't endorse it as a broader policy, and no one bothered to figure out what would happen after the war to the thousands of people who took the British at their word that they would be free. But from the bottom up, Karen has helped us see that Dunmore's improvisation was something else entirely. Enslaved women who heard of the Dunmore and Phillipsburg proclamations turned them into a plan. They studied geography. They stockpiled clothing and bedding. They disguised themselves as men, as soldiers, and as free women. They moved in groups bound by kin, both blood and fictive kin, that they had built inside slavery. These women ran while pregnant. They ran with toddlers. They ran twice when their first attempts failed. The Book of Negroes contains the names of approximately 3,000 people who reached British lines and received certificates of freedom before they sailed with the British to Nova Scotia, England, and elsewhere within the British Empire after the war. 3,000 people. Each name is a person who made a calculation the British had not. They are people who heard the rhetoric of liberty on every revolutionary tongue and weighed this rhetoric against their lived experience and then chose to run towards British lines. Karen's work reminds us that the people who knew the most about the meaning of liberty in 1776 were often the people the founders refused to count. Women like Jenny, who fled while pregnant and with her toddler in tow. Margaret Grant, who ran twice. And like Sarah, who fled a Maryland plantation on horseback in 1778 with her 6-year-old son riding alongside her and a white tailor at her side as an improvised husband. These women and many more like them didn't need a Declaration of Independence to teach them about their inalienable rights. They made that case with their feet and with their courage. You can find more information about Karen, her book, Running from Bondage, plus notes and links for everything we talked about today, all on the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/322. Friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts. So if you enjoy Ben Franklin's World, please tell your friends and family about it. Production assistance for this podcast comes from Joseph Edelman, Karen Wolf, and Morgan McCullough. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, Join us next week for a new episode about the escapes of David George, with a guest who joined us all the way back in episode 8 of Ben Franklin's World, Greg O'Malley. Ben Franklin's World is a production of Clio Digital Media, and support for this episode comes from the Massachusetts Historical Society, the first historical society founded in the United States in 1791.